Hello, viewers. Will Underwood here. Welcome back to the Huddle. I'm joined today by Fisayo Oke, founder and CEO of Gamble Alert. Fisayo, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Will, for having me. Very well, thank you. How are you too?
Good. Good, thank you. Yes, I'm excited to talk. We're going to be talking all things Africa today. Very exciting, very fast developing marketplace, and as a continent in general within our industry. So, yeah, I think to sort of open things up and lead things in, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your company, Gamble Alert, what it is you do, and how you think your mission is vital to the sort of continent and the gaming marketplace within it.
Thank you. So my organization is Gamble Alert, as you have correctly mentioned, and we lead the non-profit organization around responsible gambling in Nigeria and a few other African markets, Kenya being one of them. Right. So what we do is around prevention, research, treatment support, advisory for regulators, and then training offerings as well for gaming operators. So pretty much everything within the responsible gaming ecosystem is what we do around the African countries that we work in. Apart from self-exclusion that we think should be regulator-led in each jurisdiction. So pretty much that's the work that we do. We are the first in the West Africa at the moment, and then we're the biggest still. There are about 5, 6 other organizations now, but yeah, we were leading the responsible gaming charge in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And where did you see the gap, and why did you feel like it needs to be filled in West Africa? What was the thought process behind kind of setting up the organization for that part of the region?
Right. I used to be with a regulator within the gambling space. And because of my role, a number of persons would reach out to me to say they have a complaint. And some of them were telling me stories just so they could get operators to pay them their winnings and what have you. But the stories they were telling were quite sorry ones. And I thought there was a problem that needed to be solved. And I wanted to volunteer with an organization that was doing RG in Africa, just to lend my voice, being a regulator. And then I realized that there was none at the time. So I thought, well, just maybe the burden was mine then to start one if I started thinking about it already. And then we started Gamble Alert as an advocacy group, talking to people about responsible gambling, going to different communities, and then, picking the low-hanging fruit, getting to schools to talk about the dangers of underage gambling. And then we started growing into developing our model around prevention, around research, to treatment support based on need. And then we realized that because the need was growing, we needed to develop a department for our clinical support. And today is our biggest department. And then we also now do training programs for gaming operators. So they invite us for training support for their staff in fulfillment of the law as well, and then advisory for gaming regulators across. So yeah, that's the brief behind it.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I mean, we first came across each other at the Ethical Gambling Forum recently, and you did a really good panel, and you focused specifically on 3 key markets across Africa, which were South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. I was just wondering why you chose within that context to kind of highlight these 3 markets and why they're so vital and prominent within the wider continent.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of gambling population, these 3 markets are the biggest. So it makes sense to highlight them. Also, in terms of regulatory maturity, you would mention these 3 first as well. First, South Africa, followed by Nigeria, and then Kenya. Right? We see very recently Botswana, taking the lead in terms of maturity in the regulatory space, but still in terms of market size, you would still choose these 3, and that's where you would also get the most of these gambling operators coming into. Right, so that's exactly why I had highlighted these 3.
And I mean, maturity is a really good segue for my next question. I want to talk about the Nigerian market specifically. As you mentioned previously, a bit of a fragmented state-by-state regulatory nature, similar to some of the markets that we know quite well. And I was wondering if you could walk us through a little bit about the state of the Federation of State Regulators, and tell us a little bit about the idea behind that kind of group, and how you think it has, changed or altered the market, and how you think it has the potential to help things going forwards.
Great. So it makes sense to lay a background to where the country is coming from in terms of the regulatory landscape. Before now, so there used to be a tussle between the states and the federal government on who has the power to regulate the gambling industry. In fact, Lagos State used to be the one leading the charge. In fact, they were the first regulatory authority to be in charge of gambling activities. We also had the lotteries regulator at the federal level. And then we realized that the federal level began to grow its operations to cover every aspect of gambling. And that didn't sit well with the state, because they thought the constitution says, look, it should be the states, regulating. And then that tussle went to court, and then it sat in court for 16 years. So for 16
Wow.
years, there was the fight between who has the power. There was confusion amongst gaming operators as well. Where do we go? So for some operators who still wanted to operate by all means, they would get license from the federal and then go to the states where they want to operate and then still get license. Because, you've got to look past all of these things. The market is ripe, so you want to still stay there. But then in 2024, we saw that the Supreme Court decided that the states had the power to regulate the landscape. And then what happened immediately was that the National Lottery Regulatory Commission was effectively, disbanded. Because, if you have no legal backing for your operations, you have nothing to regulate at the end of the day. So we saw that states started taking all the powers to themselves to regulate. While that was very good in terms of clarity for the industry, that created a problem of fragmentation, right? So especially for player protection, the operators who wanted to come into the Nigerian market would think, which of the states do I need to get a license for? Do I need to interface with 36 states plus the FCT, making 37? How about I just get one license and then I can operate in any of the states? Does it not make sense to have the federal now, giving the license? So these questions were coming up. And then the state regulators also recognize the fact that it's not easy on operators to begin to interface with very many states, especially those who have operations across different states. So they say, look, let's come together under the Federation of State Gaming Regulators and then issue one unified license under that framework. And then we have similar provisions of policies, to guide the operations of gaming companies. And that's what they have done. And since then, we've seen some operators, who are coming in, complying, and then getting some of these licenses from the unified licensing framework of the FSGRN. So that's what has been happening. In terms of player protection and its significance around this fragmented policy or framework that we currently have, we've not seen so much in terms of achievement of the FSGRN. We think that the FSGRN is a very brilliant idea, especially because we know that states have different capacities. There are states who are still grappling with how to properly regulate the industry, how to even have their licensing structure and what have you. So the issue of responsible gaming hasn't been so much of priority to them. But it makes sense that under the Federation of State Gaming Regulators, they're able to say, look, it doesn't matter your capacity. This is the unified standard across different states, and this is what you have to do. And I think this is where the Federation is headed. They have agreed on the licensing structure, which is, of course, the basis of the operations of the companies, in fact. And they are moving towards working with different stakeholders in terms of data protection, anti-money laundering, player protection, and general other general issues. Yeah, so that's basically for FSGRN.
And where do you think Nigeria is at with regard to tackling its black market, which obviously can have a huge knock-on effect, with regards to player protection and responsible gambling? And I believe kind of currently accounts for about 60 or 70% of the overall gambling market right now. Where is the country at in sort of that process?
Right. So the conversation is ongoing. No country on its own is able to fight the black market because it's called black market because it's not resident in your country and it's not regulated. So at the moment, there are different associations that have been formed. There is the Gaming Regulators of Africa Forum, that's GRAF. There is also the African iGaming Alliance, who these associations are always coming together to discuss. So the Gaming Regulators Forum is, as the name implies, is for the regulators to come together to fight common issues within different jurisdictions. So the biggest one for them would, of course, be the fighting the unregulated market. So they're working together with different regulators across the African market to see how they can bounce off ideas, share notes, of course, to fight it. So yes, the work is ongoing. I know that the Lagos State is very much serious about fighting the black market, and I know that they are doing a very serious job with the African iGaming Alliance to ensure that that doesn't happen. We see a number of successful strides that they have been making, carrying along a number of other regulators to say, look, this is not something that you can gloss over. This is something that you've got to work on. So yeah, we see that they are working very hard to ensure that that aspect is reduced. We know it cannot be eradicated, especially because of the new prediction market, which is growing very seriously. It definitely cannot be eradicated, but yes, to be reduced to the barest minimum. I know that regulators are working very hard in that regard.
And sort of observing those three markets we pointed out there, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, where do you see the sort of key strengths and weaknesses of each, particularly with regard to player protection? I'm sure they differ massively in terms of culture and gaming, gaming taste and those kinds of things. So how do you kind of separate those with it from a sort of responsible gambling standpoint?
Right. So for me, I would say that South Africa has the most mature regulatory structure in Africa, and that's because the idea of responsible gaming, or the notion, the principle of responsible gaming as far as South Africa is concerned, is as old as 22 years old. They've been on it for a while. In Nigeria, it's less than 6 years old. In fact, I think that responsible gaming in terms of practice started with gamble alerts in Nigeria. So it's like it's either we started it or the regulator started it at the same time that gamble alerts started. So it's about 5.5 years old. So one would easily be able to say that South Africa has the most mature regulatory structure for player protection. You would see a tradition of consumer protection being embedded in the licensing framework. So you don't get a license if you don't show proof that you're able to protect your player. There's the integration of RG, AML, financial compliance, all of them under the licensing structure. So there's higher institutional capacity to get RG done in South Africa than most other African markets. But of course, they also have their own weaknesses. So you see that as much as they have this capacity, there's still the high level of illegal and offshore gambling ecosystem, which, of course, no matter how strong you are, it just undermines every effort, every progress that you think you may have made in terms of protecting the player. But generally, we see that South Africa has the most mature market. I would say Nigeria follows almost immediately. Nigeria may not have the most mature regulatory framework in terms of player protection, but I think that what they have is the highest amount of momentum. Right. So for self-exclusion, for instance, Nigeria started Safely being the self-exclusion portal for all gaming operators. So it means that as long as you're licensed under the Lagos state government, you are automatically listed for self-exclusion. So you cannot on your platform say you are not allowing players to self-exclude. Once a person self-excludes using the Safe Play platform, across board, you are just unable, the person is just unable to access any kind of gambling site that is regulated. There's also the very strong advocacy ecosystem in Nigeria, and I dare say led by Gamble Alert. We don't see that in very many other African countries. We see in South Africa, South African Responsible Gambling Foundation, which is a very strong institution, by the way. But in terms of momentum of advocacy and what have you, we see a whole lot of that in Nigeria. In fact, regulators and operators joining civil societies to go to different communities to advocate for responsible gambling. And that's not something we always, see. To pick Kenya from this part of advocacy, we see that they also have taken up this idea of going to different communities. So, gaming operators, now this is not for regulators now, but gaming operators coming together under one umbrella, one association to say, look, we want to go to different communities. We want to raise awareness for responsible gaming. We see an increase from Nigeria and then Kenya in terms of public, I would say, people identifying, yes, publicly identifying with responsible gambling. We didn't used to see this before now, but operators and regulators, publicly identifying with responsible gambling, that's something for Nigeria and Kenya. But for Kenya, what's specific to them is right now they have some of the tightest policies around responsible gambling. So that's how the markets differ. South Africa, most mature market, Nigeria, the highest momentum, and then Kenya has very strict policies, and then the tech ecosystem also to protect players. So that's how I'm going to rank them. South Africa, maturity, Nigeria, momentum, and then Kenya, I would say that they have strict policies.
This is going to be my last question today, so thank you very much for your time again, Fisayo. There's been a general sort of, I want to say consensus, but indication in my research that one of the things organizations like Gamble Alert are trying to change is the idea that many operators and regulators alike are still prioritizing revenue ahead of responsible gambling. Could you unpack that a little bit for me, just to close things out?
Yes, so it makes sense for people to conclude that operators, are prioritizing revenue over player protection, and that's the honest truth in different jurisdictions, Nigeria being one of them. And it goes back to regulatory capacity to enforce player protection amongst them. There are operators who are aware that they need to protect players. They see the behavioral indicators on their platform that some players are actually exhibiting markers of harm, but they just leave them to continue in that trend. And because there are no consequences, they continue to do that. So, which is why it's easy to conclude that gaming operators are prioritizing revenue. I think that for every business, revenue has to be top of their priorities, right? So I just think that it makes sense that when they are thinking revenue, they need to also de-risk their platform, which is what they need to do. And we don't see a lot of them doing it. But then when regulators begin to take player protection as seriously as they would take anti-money laundering, as seriously as they would take data protection, then we will be able to say as much as operators are prioritizing revenue, they are also prioritizing player protection. Because really, I don't think that we would ever get to a point where operators would not prioritize revenue. I don't think we'll ever get there. Maybe we are chasing shadows if we're asking them to not prioritize the exact reason they're in business. So it just makes sense that side by side they're able to as well protect the players.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, really, really interesting insights, and thank you again for your time today, Fisayo. I'm sure we'll catch each other again and have a great rest of your week. And thank you to yourselves, viewers. We will catch you in the next one.